Hi, everybody, and welcome once again to Story Hour. I am your host, Daniel Marcus. My wonderful co-host is Laura Blackwell, and it is Wednesday evening in California, and we are back again bringing you what we believe is among the best spoken word speculative fiction you can hear anywhere. We feature work from across the entire range of speculative fiction, horror, fantasy, hard SF, space opera, cyberpunk, slipstream, weird, dark, weird, and more. We welcome new writers who have just sold their first few stories, The Ink's Barely Dry, all the way to award-winning season pros, and really everybody in between, because kind of most of us are kind of in between. Well, I started this thing over 5 years ago, and it was in the early days of the pandemic, and things were pretty weird. And I just wanted to create a space where my writer friends and I could get together and share our work and enjoy a little community, really sort of shelter in place against the chaos. And very shortly after I kicked it off, I asked my good friend and colleague Laura Blackwell to join me in co-hosting, and we have been at it ever since. It's 5.5 years later, which is mind-blowing, but yeah, 5.5 years later, things are still pretty weird out there and uh, trending weirder, but Story Hour is still here. And we're not going anywhere. I think we really need stories more than ever right now. Um, Story Hour relies on a very ancient tradition. It's really simple. It's basically folks sitting around the fire telling lies. So every week we continue this practice. We have two speculative fiction authors. We give them just shy of 30 minutes each, narrating their own original work. That's it. No interviews, no Q&A before or after, just the good stuff. Um, we want to thank SIFWA for their very generous grant, which helps us keep the lights on and keep these rooms open. Thank you, SIFWA. And with that, we welcome our authors this evening, Natasha Calder and Michael Haynes. And we're going to start the program tonight with Natasha Calder. Natasha is a graduate of Clarion West 2018. Go Clarion West, yay! And the author of Whether Violent or Natural, which was published in 2023 by Bloomsbury and the Overlook Press, and longlisted for the Nota Bene Prize in 2024. Her shorter work has appeared in The Stinging Fly, Granta, Lackingtons, and a variety of other venues. She is also one half of Calder Sheshwak, the writing team behind The Offset, which was released in September 2021 by Angry Robot Press. It's a great press with a great name. Currently based in the UK, Natasha is a British and Greek citizen with South African heritage. Natasha, welcome back. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. Apologies, first of all, I've got a bit of a cold, so hopefully this is not going to be too dreadful. The story I'm going to read today is called hotBooley. It was published by Opulent Syntax, which was a Neon Hemlock publication. And it's about, actually, it was based on my experiences of the housing crisis in Dublin. And Dublin is still has one of the worst housing situations in the whole of Europe. And I wrote it when I was living there. Well, I say living in Dublin, apart from I wasn't actually living in Dublin because it's really hard to actually live in Dublin. I was living in a city called Bray, which is at the top of County Wicklow. Anyway, okay, here goes. In all fairness, you have it pretty good at the start. The world is in your sights. Or that's how it feels when you get your points. All that agonizing over your exams and it paid off. You're going to college. More importantly, you're going to college in Dublin, 300 miles from here. Not nearly far enough, you think, but it's a start. You sign up for a student account with hotBooley the moment the offer comes through on CAO. Your parents aren't thrilled. They've read all about those fiberglass capsules springing up in the city, and they're not sure it's safe. But it's not like there's any alternative, not with rents the way they are. You tell your parents it'll be grand and laugh at them for worrying, a glib front you manage to maintain for the rest of the summer, even when your mother shows you a story about some UCD student, a Mayo lad who'd been found dead in a hotBooley the year before. Look, you say, pointing to the last paragraph on the cracked screen. The Gardaí aren't treating it as suspicious. It could have been anything, ma'am. Meningitis, an overdose, Jesus. Anyway, it's not like I'm going to UCD. You say it like it matters, like you really think that's how it works. Your mother stares at you, but says nothing. For all your bravado, the story about the dead boy from Mayo haunts you as you sit on a hard bench outside the arts block at the end of your first day of lectures, nervously awaiting your billet. What if it's on Sheriff Street? Can it really be as rough as everyone says? Probably it is. Probably you'll be mugged. Probably you'll have your throat slit in the night by a junkie having a psychotic break. But when the alert finally comes through to your phone, you're relieved to discover you've been billeted to a hotBooley on Nassau Street, just a stone's throw from where you are now. You find it easy as anything, unlock the door with your app and settle in for a good night's sleep. As you drift off, nestled safe and warm in the close embrace of the fiberglass walls, you wonder that you could have ever have worried. This is fine. This is absolutely fine. But not every hotBooley, it transpires, is as good as the first. Most are double occupancy and way out of town, sometimes as far afield as Drogheda. Beyond these particulars, there is little room for variation. The basic setup of each hotBooley is the same: an opaque capsule with space for a double bunk and 2-foot lockers. There's Wi-Fi included, but nothing else. No kitchen, no lounge, no bathroom. You quickly get used to sleeping alongside strangers and taking your showers at the college gym. Sure, you're out most nights anyway, finding yourself at Panty Bar or at the George, reveling in a world you could only dream of back in Tralee. Dublin, you are sure, is your future. But nonetheless, you still spend every weekend at home, dutifully manning the coffee machine in the cafe your mother runs. She says she needs the help, that she can't get reliable staff, that the weekend shifts would be hectic otherwise. Really, she's just keeping an eye on you, making sure you get at least 1 or 2 decent nights of sleep in a week. Either way, it's the price of your Monday, Friday freedom. She's the one stumping up for your annual registration fees after all, so there's no arguing with her. Not when you explain how the weekly disruption is doing your head in, not when you point out that your pay barely covers the train fare. Come the holidays, of course, you'll be only delighted to work in the cafe, even if it does mean living under your mother's increasingly watchful eye, day in, day out. The long summer months usually bring in a fair number of American tourists, and they're generous tippers, probably even when they're not all hyped up from discovering their ancient roots or the wild Atlantic way. You'll earn enough to put away a tidy sum, enough to live on the following year, provided you're careful and don't frit away your earnings on shots or blow it on the class trip to Christ alive Westport. And there are always those generous cash gifts from Art Finola to see you through. It's a bit of a balancing act, but you keep it all together. You're young, after all, and you've got the goodwill of your nana's prayers behind you. No harm, like. Besides, it's not as though you're the only one embracing the life of the neo-nomad. All the college students in Dublin are on hotBooley subscriptions. Well, nearly all. Most of the Gonzaga boys live at home with their parents in beautifully appointed houses, which is only to be expected. They generally have the good grace to be sheepish about it and, whether out of guilt or a desire not to miss out on this essential college experience, tend to ecstasy any time you invite one of them to spend the night. So you do, often enough. It's a Gonzaga boy who helps you discover that nothing hotbox is better than a hotBooley. It's a Gonzaga boy who spends a fevered evening pouring hard seltzer from his mouth to yours, punctuating his every kiss with exclamations about how real you are. And it's a Gonzaga boy who, when you make an awful joke about knowing what travellers must feel like, judges you not unkindly, pressing your hand and explaining with gentle patience that it's not the same, that the joke is particularly ill-judged given that hotBooley has been buying up halting sites to build more capsules, and that many travellers can't even subscribe because you need a settled address to sign up. Well, it's not like I have a settled address, you protest. The boy looks and looks at you until at last you work it out, until at last you remember. Your parents' address. That's what you put in the form. That's what gets you the unrivaled privilege of sleeping in a fiberglass box. Feck. You hate hotBooley, but you couldn't live without it. Then, before you know it, your college years are over, leaving you with a 2-1 and an ineffable sense of disappointment, one that sharpens when it occurs to you that you've still the rest of your life to come and no clue how to go about it. Weren't you supposed to know by now? Wasn't college supposed to be the answer? Maybe not. Looking around at your friends and peers, it doesn't seem like any of them have worked it out either. But you must do something, pick some path. So, lacking any other guidance, you allow Dublin to become your sole ambition. And why not? It's the one place where you can be yourself. And so long as you can pay your own way, your mother can't argue. She's taken to dropping hints about the management trainee scheme at the cafe, how the chain she works for is always keen to market its outlets as family businesses. The thought of it nearly brings you out in a rash. She says she's just looking out for you, that it can't be doing you any good carrying on in Dublin with the way things are, that you'd be better off at home. But she doesn't understand what it means to you, being in the city, having no one to answer to but yourself. how it's the only prospect you have, how you can't go back to being a kid again, no matter how much he wishes you would. There's a gap opening up between you. And if you can find a decent position in Dublin, then you'll be able to keep some of that distance and perhaps some dignity too. Decided, you set yourself the task of applying to every job that your shiny degree qualifies you for, and try not to book when it proves to be a very short list indeed. A month passes before you hear a single thing back. And even then, every response you receive is a rejection, terse and formulaic. You're already halfway to convincing yourself that a lifetime in the cafe wouldn't be the end of the world when, finally, your luck turns. A pal of your aunt's cousin has a job going, and it's yours if you want it, paying just enough that you can deal with a substantial hike in hotBooley subscription fees that's coming once you lose your student discount. So you take the job and thank your lucky stars that you now have an office to escape to, where you sit at a different plastic desk every day at the open plan and stare at spreadsheets, resenting the work for being repetitively monotonous, while also nursing the prickly private shame of being sure that this is all you deserve, that it's your own fault for not having chosen a different degree, for not having studied harder. But there's still Panty Bar, and there's still the George, and if this is what it takes to stay in Dublin, to stay independent, then this is what you'll do. It's only in your 30s that the luster begins to fade. You're starting to hear of people your age, friends of friends, career types, getting a foothold in the rental market. You think how pleasant it would be to lie down in the same bed every night surrounded by the same four walls, to have a sturdy front door with a lock and key, to maybe live with a few people and really get to know them, maybe even become friends. But with most of your monthly salary now going on hotBooley, you have no more than about, €300 languishing in the credit union, so there's no way you'll ever be able to scrape together enough for a deposit, not if you carry on like this. You look at social housing, but the waiting list is years long. And besides, that salary of yours, mean as it may feel, is still enough to disqualify you. Short of getting yourself thrown into Mountjoy, what else can you do? Because you're not moving home, not when it means giving your mother the satisfaction of being proved right, not when she's sending you links nearly every day to think pieces and blogs about the unrivaled benefits of leaving the city. No, the world will keep on turning, and you will just have to keep on finding the wherewithal to pay your way in it. There is one upshot, though. Knowing that rent is unattainable does afford you a certain kind of freedom. It's enough for you to talk yourself into upgrading to the premium service. You still have to move every night, but you're guaranteed a single occupancy hotBooley that will be no more than an hour's walk from your registered place of work. Those basic needs dealt with, you put the idea of renting to the back of your mind and get on with your life. It's a bright September afternoon when you run into one of those Gonzaga boys from your college days, and he takes you on a drive out to his favourite spot, Mount Usher Gardens. You sit there together in the dappled sunlight, sipping Avoca coffees and talking about nothing in particular. It's close to heavenly, bringing you a quietude that you haven't known in years. After a moment's pause, the boy, a man now, you suppose, tells you how fondly he remembers the night you spent together in one of the hotBoolies, and how envious he was back then of your freedom, living away from the scrutiny of parents. You smile indulgently and shape your tongue around some flirtatious remark, and then he asks you if you ever miss it, if passing by a hotBooley ever leaves you nostalgic. Whatever you'd been going to say, you swallow. In the face of his obliviousness, how can you explain? It will be humiliating for you both. So you really shrug, then listen politely as he starts to tell you about the lease he inherited from his grandmother and his current battle with the landlord to get the walls repainted. You part on cordial enough terms, but later, as you lie curled up in a hotBooley off Temple Bar and struggle to sleep amidst the clamour of drunk tourists traipsing past, you find yourself thinking of him with a stab of anger that's a lot like hate. Sorry, just 1 second, I have to. Oh, better. All right. Sorry, I'll carry on. You soldier on for several more years until finally it gets too much. You know it's too much because you started to have recurring dreams about living in direct provision, and you wake up every morning simultaneously wishing it were true and despising yourself for believing, even subconsciously, that it wouldn't be 1,000 times worse than your life already is. Certainly, though, things are not good. The hotBooley is getting worse and worse for wear, and the system's becoming more and more temperamental. Some nights you never get your billet. Some nights you get your billet and turn up only to find that five others have been accidentally billeted there as well. Sometimes you turn up and the lockpad doesn't recognize your app. One time you turn up and there isn't even a hotBooley there. You've heard that one or other of those anonymous hacker collectives has been trying to jailbreak the capsules in order to open them up for the homeless. There are more than ever sleeping rough on Dublin streets. And you think that this could have something to do with them, but it could just as easily have been a bunch of lads on a dare with a stolen digger. Whatever the truth, you've had enough. It's been coming for a while and now you're sure. You just can't take the noise of it anymore. The transience, the being constantly cramped, the frustration of dealing with a faceless service desk that has never once, in your experience, sent out a maintenance drone in response to a logged issue. Not the missing door in East Wall, not the dangerously overheated capsule in Rialto, not the smears of shit on the bed sheets in Vibsborough. You're sick of bracing yourself to find out where you've been billeted, of always having to carry your entire life with you in a single rucksack, of having to spend a small fortune on disinfectant. You want a room of your own that you can keep clean, and so, at long last, you give in and move out. You move home. The plan is simple enough. Put in a few years living with your parents, work every shift going at the cafe, and, if you can manage it, spend next to nothing. That way, you should be able to scrape together an 18-month deposit before you turn 40. You know you won't ever be able to rent in Dublin itself, but maybe a reasonable lease will open up in one of the commuter towns and you'll be back, in easy reach of what you loved about the city, free of that which you could no longer stand. At first, it's a relief to be home. You sleep for 3 days straight and delight in being able to walk from room to room, but soon you find it grating. The silence that you thought would be peace, the monotony that you thought would be stability. And it's humiliating, being back in your childhood bedroom, sponging off mum and dad, having to endure the pitying stares of all those busybody neighbours and acquaintances in the street. To your mortification, you discover that, after having spent most of your adulthood in the hotBoolies, you've become so reliant on canteens and diners that you've practically forgotten how to cook and wash up. You thought everything would get easier once you got out of the city, but now you're barely coping. There is what spark in the grey. Your latest flame, a real ride, the man you'd just begun to get to know before you left Dublin, said he'd be in the area soon enough and promised to stop by. You don't know what you'll do, where you'll go, because home is out of the question. But you can hardly wait. Only then he changes his mind, changes his plans, his heart. He tells you he's not sure when he'll next be out west, and it hits you hard, harder than you expected. To make matters worse, the job you assumed would always be there for you in the cafe is gone. It's a few weeks after you return that your mother finally answers your questions straight and explains everything, tight-lipped. A sorry tale of fraudulent accounts and criminal investigations, of the parent company collapsing into administration, of hundreds of outlets being shut down, of management buyouts and mergers. The long and short of it is that the cafe has changed hands and most of the original staff have been let go. Your mother says she's lucky the new owner is letting her stay on, because not everyone understands the value of having a familiar face behind the counter. But she's in no position to pull favours for you now. If you wanted the job so badly, she says, you should have copped on and taken her up on it the first time she offered. You snap then, making a snide remark about how much she'd have liked that, having you back home and firmly under her thumb the second you graduated. And then you're into it, the argument you've both managed to avoid for so long. She says moving to Dublin gave you some awful notions, that you're full of yourself, that you don't care one bit about the family you always seem so desperate to get away from. You retort that if you're desperate, then it's only because she's insufferable, because it's suffocating, the way she insists on treating you like a baby. To which she says that you are her baby. She'll treat you however she damn well pleases. There are plenty in the world who can only dream of having someone to look after them like she has always looked after you. And she isn't wrong in her way, but you spit your curses at her all the same and storm out of the house as though you have somewhere else to go. You don't, of course. You cut an angry circuit through town and arrive back at your own front door. Only it's not yours, not really. For what must be the 100th time, you wonder whether you should have ever left Dublin and what your chances would be of getting your old job back. It's not beyond the bounds of reason. It hasn't been that long and you left on good enough terms. It couldn't hurt to ask. You go into the house, slipping noiselessly up the stairs and into your bedroom before anyone can intercept you. It only takes a moment to dig out your old manager's contact details and you're about to place the call when there's an angry clatter of pots and pans from the kitchen below. Ma'am, clearly set on making her continued displeasure known. You decide you'd better put off calling until things have calmed down. In the meantime, you see about reactivating your hotBooley account. It's then you discover the worst. Because when you open the app, a pastel-coloured notice tells you that hotBooley is over capacity right now. There is, it seems, a freeze on subscriptions. You can pay to join a waiting list, but there's no indication of how long the wait might be. It could be months, years even, according to a thread you find in one well-reputed forum. Besides, the fee is more than you can afford. You're out of the system now. There's no going back. You do your best to rally, telling yourself that it's not so bad. You were through with hotBooley anyway, and you're lucky to have any kind of roof over your head. You're bound to find a local job eventually, and maybe you'll even get used to being here, to being home for good. Downstairs, the front door slams. It's your mother, off out on some errand or simply to walk off her own foul humour. The house falls silent. You sit on the edge of your single bed, stare at the faded sheets, and try to remember the child who used to lie there. You wonder what the past you would think of you now, and find you're not sure. It's hard to recall what you used to imagine life would be like, what your hopes were, your dream. But whatever they were, you figure they can't have been worth much. They didn't get you very far, after all. That's it.
Yeah, that was brutal and awesome. Thank you so much. Oh,
Isn't it horrifying how familiar it feels,
oh
despite
man.
being this fictional world that doesn't quite exist yet?
Please don't say yet. But yeah,
Well, just that feeling of how society fails the young.
I know, man.
You
Yeah,
know, how
exactly.
it acts like you're always going to be like this next phase is always going to work, and then a lot of the time it
Yeah,
doesn't.
maybe not.
We don't
Mm.
really have the right supports for people.
No, I was just as I looked over the story again, because it was a few years now, I was wondering whether, oh, it'll be really out of date, but no, it's still just
No, not
what's
at all.
happening.
It's pretty
Yeah,
acute. It's pretty acute. Well,
I
thank
just
you
hope
so
no.
much. Um,
thank you. And thanks for bearing
Lovely.
with the bad vocals.
Oh no, you're great. Lovely work.
You, you're so valiant to read for us, even with the cold. I'm so sorry.
Yes, we so
No, it's a
appreciate it.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Natasha Calder, folks. It's our custom here at Story Hour to just breathe between works, just take a moment to sort of reset. And so I like to stop and take a breath, and y'all can do whatever you like, but that's what I'm going to do. So, Natasha Calder, folks, thanks so much. Um, our next author is Michael Haynes, also returning to Story Hour. Michael's an avid short fiction reader and writer with nearly 100 published stories, most in the speculative fiction genres. His 2025 short story collection, Three Things Cameron Couldn't Tell You, Stories of Miscommunication, includes more than 24 of his stories. Michael lives in Colorado and has more hobbies than he really has time for, enjoying travel, going to concerts, photography, cooking, geocaching, hiking, board games, and so on. You can learn more at his website, michaelhaynes.info, or say hi on Blue Sky at michaelhaynes.bsky.social. Michael, welcome back. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to be reading one of the stories from the collection, so I'll hold it up real quick so folks can see it. Three Things Cameron Couldn't
Nice.
Tell You. I am going to be reading a story titled Carolina that was originally published in Haven Spec in 2022. Carolina. Randy Joe Eastman popped a few aspirin in his mouth and swallowed them with a mouthful of last night's coffee. 2 in the afternoon, and he still wasn't dressed for the day. But hell, that had been most of the last 29 years, driving from city to city, playing a night or two at every club or bar or honky tonk would pay him enough to keep him going. There'd been those 2 years, 19 and a half months actually, back before grunge broke out of Seattle, when an actual label had carried him and he'd been on something vaguely other than his own. Those days were so far gone that he often felt like they belonged to someone else. And when a woman, it was always a woman, came up to him before or after a show and told him that she was a big fan of his music, those days did belong to someone else, because she would always go on to tell him that Carolina had been her favorite song of his. And why didn't you write anything else like that? Some of them would ask. He would shrug, and there's something about the muse or the creative process or some other bullshit. But the truth of the matter was that he hadn't felt anything like that since Carolina. And just like part of him wished those starbound days had belonged to some other singer, part of him wished he hadn't ever felt that in the first place. At least then he wouldn't know what he was missing. Joe climbed out of bed a bit slowly. At 52 years old, he did most everything a bit slowly. But by 3, he had his motor running, and his motor too, and he was on his way for a solid meal and a few drinks somewhere dark and quiet before his gig. More than a few whiskeys later, he pulled into a parking spot behind the original Red Dog Tavern. They'd booked him for Thursday and Friday night. By the looks of things in the front lot, he hoped they were expecting a bigger crowd Friday. He stepped out of his car unsteadily, and his hand bumped against the door frame, sending a jolt of pain up his arm and his keys tumbling to the ground. They clattered on the blacktop and bounced beneath his truck. Son of a bitch, he muttered, cradling his arm and crouching to look for them. He groped around under the truck, ass in the air, and wasn't any attention to what was going on around him until someone cleared their throat behind him and spat. Just then, his fingers found his keys. He stood up fast, his vision blurring as he did so, and his pulse thudding in his ears. "You Randy, Joe?" asked the throat-clearing spitter, a middle-aged man with red hair and a long beard tending toward white. "Yeah, that's me." He blinked, trying to clear the fuzziness from his brain. "Todd Carlisle." The man smiled and reached out a hand. "This is my place. Let me give you the tour before you get set up." He shook the bar owner's hand and kicked his truck's door shut. "Sure thing, boss man," he said, even managing a grin. It didn't take long for Carlisle to show Randy Joe around, but it was just long enough. When Randy Joe went back outside, he found the doors of his truck flung open. A sick feeling brewed inside him, and it overflowed when he saw that the gear he'd stashed in the passenger seat, his guitars mainly, was gone. Randy Joe hollered and ran out front, hoping to catch some vagrant hobbling away under the weight of his instruments, but the front parking lot was still quiet. Randy Joe slacked to his truck. The rest of his stuff was still in the back, probably too much for the thief to try to get away quickly with, but the amps and all the rest weren't going to do him a bit of good without an instrument. He slammed the door shut and leaned against the truck. He didn't need this. Not now. Not ever, but especially not now. He was counting on the money from this gig. His truck worked, and he'd been babying it through the last couple of weeks as it was. He had to be able to use his truck to get to where he performed, so he could make money, and... He shook his head violently. It wouldn't do to think this way. Carlisle had to know someone who'd have a guitar. Seeing as how it was on his property that Randy Joe's got lifted, the man ought to have at least a bit of sympathy, or at least the good grace to act like he did. "Well," Carlisle said when Randy Joe explained what happened. He drew the word out long and slow. "You're in luck, my friend." "Oh?" "Yep." Carlisle stood and ambled into a storeroom. Joe followed. "Guy was in here a couple weeks ago playing. Eli Rivers, you know him?" Randy Joe had heard the name, but had never met the man. He shook his head. Easiest answer. Carlisle grunted. "Well, in any case, he was pulling out, and I noticed this piece behind." The bar owner grabbed a beat-up telly and handed it to Randy Joe. "I tried to give it to him, but he told me he was done with this one, that it had done him all the good it was going to. And then he drove away. I'd half a mind to give it to my niece, but I bet you're glad I didn't, ain't you?" Randy Joe gave the guitar a cautious strum. He'd owned one like this, black instead of blonde, years and years ago, back before his brush with fame. It felt familiar, and the chord he played resonated through Randy Joe in a way that momentarily took him back to those days. "Yeah," he said a few seconds later, realizing he was staring into space and that Carlisle was staring in turn at him. "Yeah, very glad." Once he got playing, Randy Joe could pretty much do the gig on autopilot. Sure, it was work, but he'd sung most of these songs so many of the times over the years that the notes and the words came without any conscious thought. What he did think while he was playing, it was usually just to imagine mixing up the lyrics some, just to the folks trying to sing along. But he didn't have the heart to do that. These folks were paying a few bucks to come hear him sing and buying booze and food from the host. They weren't the reason his life got the way it had. He'd done that all himself. Near the end of his set, when he'd usually segue straight from hit the brick into not gonna be your fool, he found himself playing the intro to a different song. It came from one of his recent albums, which meant hardly anyone had heard it. Quitting Time, it was called. He'd written it after visiting his father's gravesite one Christmas Eve, 10 years to the day after RJ Sr. had gone. He thought briefly about just playing instrumental for a minute and then going back to his regular set list. But he liked Quitting Time, and what the hell? Folks couldn't complain too much about one unfamiliar song. If they hated it that much, they could use the opportunity to go take a leak. He sang the song, and if the audience minded, he couldn't tell the difference. Maybe he'd throw this one in his set more often, he thought. Not between Bricks and Fool. The slower song didn't feel like a good fit right between those two rockers. But there'd be a way to work in, he was sure. He wrapped up, closing out as always with the song everyone was waiting for, Carolina. He thanked them for coming out to see him, reminded them he would be there again tomorrow night, and accepted the usual smack of applause. More applause than a lot of folks would hear sincerely directed at them in their whole adult life, he'd often supposed. And he wasn't sure whether that meant he should be grateful, or if it meant folks just did a shitty job of appreciating each other. Randy Joe was stowing his gear in the storage area when a lady stopped him. Her mascara had run and her eyes were red. She touched him, and he noticed that her skin was warm and soft. "Thank you for playing that song tonight." But he was surprised when she went on to say, "The one about knowing when it's quitting time?" Fresh tears ran down her face. "My mama died last week. She'd been sick so long, but I just couldn't bear to let her go, and..." The woman couldn't go on, and Randy Joe, for the first time in longer than he could remember, found himself wrapping a fan up in a warm, genuine hug. A moment later, they both pulled away. She smiled a bit through her tears. "I only knew one song of yours, that Carolina one, but a friend of mine talked me into coming tonight, and God, I'm glad she did. I feel better than I have in..." She shook her head. "Too long. I'm glad my song helped you, ma'am." He thought about that woman off and on the rest of the night, even as he tried to sleep. Just before finally drifting, he realized he hadn't had a drink since before his show. The Friday night show started out like hundreds of others preceding it, and by the time Randy Joe hit intermission, he'd nearly forgotten about Quitting Time and the conversation he'd had last night. But later in the evening, his fingers on the beat-up telly strings, he found himself once again playing the intro to a song which hadn't been on his set list. The guitar felt warm in his hands, and the rhythm of the notes felt right under his fingers. This time, he didn't even consider passing the unplanned song by, but dove into it with gusto. One of those days was when he'd used for cutting his first demo, and though it had never been a hit, never even made it onto an album, he'd always had a bit of a soft spot for it. Not enough to play it regularly, and even then, usually only just when it was him and his guitar and no one around to listen. But playing it now, playing it here, for this audience, it felt right, but in a way he couldn't have described. Still, it was just another song about how Evan does indeed have one of those days. Maybe not quite the stereotypical country song about losing your girl, having your truck break down, and your dog dying, but pretty damn close. So it surprised him when the pretty young thing he couldn't help but notice at a table front just had to talk to him after the show to thank him for playing one of those days. "Because," she said with a flick of her hair, "I've been having one of those days every day this week, and singing along with that chorus felt like letting go of all that shit." Randy Joe smiled at her, and if he had been 20 years younger, hell, if he had been 10 years younger, he might have tried putting something extra into that smile. But he just smiled, and he thanked her for what she'd said. She hesitated a moment. Maybe she'd been hoping for that something extra, but then she returned his smile and hurried back to her friends. Randy Joe looked at the telly, leaning there against a wall. He picked it up. Everything about it felt like just another guitar, and yet he couldn't stop thinking about these past 2 nights. Carlisle would have his pay waiting for him in the office, and Randy Joe's truck needed repairs. But he felt better in this moment than he had in recent years. Before he could talk himself out of it, Randy Joe walked into Carlisle's office. "I got your money right here," the owner told him, waving an envelope in his direction. Randy Joe nodded. Hey, I'm gonna need some play at my next gig. How much if I want to hang on to this piece you lent me? The owner tapped the envelope of cash against his desk and gnawed on his lip. He looked about ready to say something, but then his gaze hid for a second. Hell, he said a heartbeat later, tossing the envelope onto the edge of the desk near Randy Joe. Well, I just gave me the thing in the first place. Why it in good health, man? Randy Joe thanked him and hurried along, and Carlyle decided that maybe the guitar was worth hanging on to after all. He didn't have the experience of feeling compelled to play a particular song at every gig, but it happened more often than not. And invariably, someone would come up to him after the show. Sometimes they were hesitant, other times bubbling over with enthusiasm, but always they wanted to tell him how that specific song he had played carried particular meaning for them in one way or another. A man in Austin told Randy Joe that I'll Be a Better Man Tomorrow with just the song he'd to hear to get his ass back in gear, too long depressed at being out of work and out of touch with his ex-wife and their son. A woman in Baton Rouge felt a kinship with the scorned woman in Third Time's the Charm, Now Get Out of My Life. And a couple came up to him in Tuscaloosa to tell him that one of them had finally seen fit to propose to the other after 12 years as a couple, as he sang, We've Got Each Other. Every time, Randy Joe smiled at the people who came to speak with him. But as the weeks went on, the initial happiness he had gotten from these encounters began to fade. Someone telling him that they liked hearing a song because it reminded them of their dead mom or brother or dog, their dog, for Christ's sake. That wasn't enough. He needed the ones that really dug in and grabbed onto you hard, like the man in Atlanta who had walked off the street from a hospital to the bar where Randy Joe was playing. He'd been keeping bedside vigil for his wife, Anne, who just that evening, just hours before, succumbed to Lou Gehrig's disease. And what song had Randy Joe been playing when this man crossed the bar's threshold but Sunshine in the Rearview Mirror? That song, he'd told Randy Joe, voice thick, tears leaking down his face. Swear to God, that song was the one playing in my dorm room the very first time. The very first time I saw it? I saw her walking across the quad, and I told my roommate. He's off here. Can't remember his name. He was from Boise and wanted to be a chemist, and he shook his head and swore. I told him, whatever his name was, I said, I've got that girl. And he laughed and told me she was the quarterback's girlfriend and I didn't stand a chance in hell. The man let out a short laugh and shook his head again. I hope he was a better chemist than psychic because Anne dumped that quarterback and we were married for 22 years. His left thumb gently stroked the gold band of his ring finger. It would have been 23 next month. That story. Oh, that story had given Randy Joe a rush and a half. Not just that it was what the man needed to hear, but the sheer cosmicness of it all. The song playing when the man first saw his future wife, also playing the moment after leaving the hospital where she had died. But stories that were few and far between. Randy Joe was getting ready in his hotel room for a Saturday night show in Nashville. He'd played Chattanooga the night before, and his performance of What Would You Say only drew a young man who said he was going to ask the cute girl he worked with what she would say if he told her he wanted to go out after work tomorrow night. Randy Joe had picked up a bottle of bourbon on his way back to the motel after that show, the first he'd purchased in weeks, and he'd almost opened it up and had a few drinks before bed. He'd managed to go to sleep sober, but in the cold light of a February afternoon, pacing around the cheap room as he waited for showtime, he thought that a few drinks would be just the thing to pass the time. He had a solid buzz going by the time he got to the bar. Another fellow was singing tonight too, but his set was running over. So Randy Joe had a few beers while he cooled his heels. He thought once that maybe he should slow it down, but the bartender brought him a cold bottle on the house, and Randy Joe drank it down. It tasted so good, he asked for another. On stage, things were fine. He could sing and play even when half drunk. He had certainly done it plenty of times before. And the beat-up old telly felt like home now, its strings and body responding to his fingers more resonantly than any instrument he had ever played before. He smiled when he began to strum the notes for One of Those Days. Tonight, he thought as he sang, would be one of the good days. He was playing this song for someone in the audience, someone who might just now be realizing how much the song meant to them. And they'd come up to him with a story tonight, a really good one. He could feel it as the words of the song rolled off his tongue. He wrapped up the set a half hour later and dawdled about getting packed up, knowing that someone would be coming up to him soon. And she did. Striking redhead with a shirt reminding him that her eyes were up here. Randy Joe wondered how many folks were able to follow the shirt's directions. I don't normally do this, she said, her lip. Randy Joe smiled easily at her, still buzzing from the show and all the beers he'd downed before it. The woman shook her head. Anyway, I just wanted to tell you that I really loved that song you sang about having one of those days, because I can totally relate to that. She dragged out the word really and totally. It grated on Randy Joe, but he kept smiling, and he managed to keep his eyes on hers most of the time. Now tell me about it. She giggled nervously. Oh, God, where to begin? Well, let's see. Oscar, that's my cat. He's been hacking up hairballs all over my apartment the last few days. And I got waitlisted by Duke for law school, and one of my car turn signals is on the fritz, and she kept going, but Randy Joe had stopped listening. His heart was pumping hard, and he got more and more irritated at the trivial shit this girl was going on about. A sick cat and waitlisted for school? That certainly didn't sound off him. And a freaking turn signal? Suddenly, he realized she'd stopped talking and was looking at him, waiting for him to say something. His jaw worked, but no words came out. He smiled briefly and shrugged. Anyway, it just felt good to know I'm not the only one who's got problems, she finally said. He knew he should thank her, but the frustration still coursed through his brain. Before he really knew what he was doing, he spoke up, practically growling, Girl, you ain't got shit for problems. Now go home and clean up after your damn cat. Her face fell, and Randy Joe turned and hurried off, a hot flush rising across his face and his heart beating fast, half angry at her and half angry at himself. In the morning, Randy Joe was only angry at himself. It was stupid to be mean to a fan, or even just a friendly office member. He was glad that he was done in Tennessee, but that meant an assload of driving up to Lexington and Cincinnati before cutting down through West Virginia and into the Carolinas. Normally, he would have had the radio playing in the truck, flipping from channel to channel, trying to catch something worth listening to. But these days, he just listened to the sound of tires on pavement, and his own voice ran around in his head. He played those shows on autopilot even more than before, and when he wasn't playing, he was drinking or sleeping, trying not to think. When he left Parkersburg Thursday afternoon for that long drive to Columbia, he took his time, making sure he wouldn't hit South Carolina until the wee hours of Friday morning. He woke in the Columbia Motel with a stale taste in his mouth and an ache in his head. A bottle of bourbon with a couple inches left sat on the bedside table. He started to reach for it, but caught himself. The last week had been bad, but there had been some pretty decent days not long ago. Maybe he could have a decent day today if he didn't start it off with a drink. There wasn't a clean cup in the room, so he gulped several handfuls of water from the bathroom faucet, showered, and headed out the door. He drove aimlessly around town until it was time to show up at the open house, the bar where playing 2 shows, Friday and Saturday. The crowd had an edgy feel Friday night, flooding the room with a nervous energy that simultaneously made Randy Joe ache for a drink and amped up the thrill he felt in playing and singing. Once again, his fingers refused to wander off and play a song on their own. Well, there was that one time when he was about to start strumming the notes for Down and Out in My Backyard that he almost felt something, like a tingle on the back of his neck and in his fingertips. But it passed, and he went right on with Down and Out. Despite not having a surprise song to play or someone coming up to him after the show with a great story, he felt good about his music and good about the day. As packing up, he noticed a woman with her face in her hands down at one of the tables near the stage. She sat alone, and when she glanced up, he could see her dark brown eyes glistening. Their gaze met for a moment before she looked away. Randy Joe put his gear in the bar's storeroom and checked the floor. The woman was still there, looking down at the empty wooden table. Without any real plan, he walked over and sat down in the chair opposite her. She glanced at him, reached for a hint of a smile. You sang real good up there, boy, she said. Randy Joe looked her over. She had a few gray hairs, but wasn't that much older than he was. Damn, He smiled and reached across the table, laying a hand on her arm. I'm always glad to meet a fan. They talked for a while, and before long her smile seemed genuine, not just put on because that's what you do to keep from feeling awkward. She glanced at her watch. Oh, God, I've got to work in the morning. I've got to get some sleep. Yep, he replied. Got to pay those bills. She smiled and thanked him for his time, and said he was a nice young man, though this time it seemed like maybe there was a subtle knowing wink in her words. Say, Randy Joe asked as she stood to leave, was there any particular song you liked hearing me play it? She tilted her head to the side, then shook it. Nope, all of them, I guess. Then she laughed and was on her way. Saturday afternoon rolled around, gray and rainy. Randy Joe woke up with a sore back and a mood to match the skies. The crowd at the open house seemed dampened that night, too. Midway through his first set, his fingers found the opening chords of Carolina. The crowd perked up, so Randy Joe went ahead and played it earlier than usual. The rest of the show was fine, but he still felt deflated when he got to the end and hadn't felt the urge to play any unplanned songs. The audience buzzed as he packed up his gear, his songs already fading from their memory. Randy Joe lugged the heavy stuff out to his truck, the telly for when he walked out the door for good, then went to see the manager about his pay. $1,200 richer, he tried to walk with a spring in his step. Reaching for the telly, though, he had to wonder if he'd opened its gift, or worse, used it up or spoiled it by being ungrateful for the smaller blessings his songs bestowed on listeners. Mr. Eastman? The voice stopped him. He hadn't expected anyone to talk to him tonight. He turned and saw a man who looked in his mid-20s. He had dark brown hair like Randy Joe's used to be, and a nervous look in his eyes. Yeah, that's me. The man bounced his weight back and forth, making Randy Joe sympathetically nervous. Finally, the young man stuck out a hand and started talking in a cascade of words. Mr. Eastman, my name is Thomas Kane, and you knew my mama back a long time ago. You would have known her as Paula Butcher, but she's Paula Kane now. And anyway, she didn't tell me this until just a few weeks ago, and I don't even know if you know it, but I guess that it turns out that you're my dad. And I tried to come in to hear you play yesterday, but I just didn't have the guts. And then I came in tonight, and I was here. I wasn't sure I was going to stay, but then you played my mama's song. She told me it was your one hit, that you got your one hit from her, and she got me from you. And, well, I just had to talk to you. And I had to, I had to say hi. Randy Joe remembered Paula. How could he not? He'd thought about settling down in Carolina with her, but he had his career to think about, and she didn't want to move away from her family. He'd just driven off one night like a coward, and he'd never heard from her since. Certainly nothing about her being pregnant or them having a son. But he looked at this young man, and with his familiar hair and those gray-green eyes, just like Randy Joe remembered Paula having, well, he was sure that this boy wasn't lying and that his mama wasn't mistaken. He clasped his hand and watched a wave of relief flow over the younger man's face. I guess we got a lot to talk about, Thomas, don't we? The other man nodded. Yes, sir. Sir, huh? Well, why not? They sat at a table and talked last call, drinking sweet teas until the bartender stopped by very pointedly with their check. Finally, they both stood up, and impulsively Randy Joe pulled Thomas into a brief, tight hug. They headed for the front door together. Randy Joe would have to circle the building to get to his truck, but he wanted to see what his son was driving. He also wanted to spend a few more minutes with the young man. Hey, Randy Joe! One of the bar staff hollered for him as he and his son were about to step outside. Hey, man, you left your guitar behind. The fellow pointed at the battered Telecaster, the one that encouraged Randy Joe to play Carolina early in his set tonight. Randy Joe glanced at his son, looked back to the man on the stage with the old guitar. He thought for a moment, and then he decided, don't worry about it, he said, wake of his head. That guitar has done what it can for me. Just hang on to it. Some other fella might need it someday, all right? The guy on stage wrinkled his forehead, but shrugged and grabbed the telly on his way backstage. He stopped and lifted the guitar in both hands, examining it closely, head cocked as if hearing a distant tune. Randy Joe nodded once to himself and smiled, turning to slip from the open house with his son, the telly no longer his, but Carolina still on his mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was lovely. That was so sweet. Um, Had a real Rod Serling feel to it for me. The magical object that bends somebody's arc. But really, really lovely work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hmm. Well, Laura, another fine night. We are lucky.
We are indeed very lucky people.
Hmm. Well, so I want to thank our writers tonight. Um, Really great work. Michael Haynes and I'm sorry, and Natasha Calder. Um, we'll be here next week. We're gonna have Sonia Falk and me uh, reading. So come on back. Um, as always, I want to thank my co-host Laura Blackwell for making all of this possible for all of us. And again, really lovely work, Natasha, Michael. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all next week. Night, folks.